Good morning from Los Angeles. My name is Winston Moore, and I am the chairperson of the Getty Research Institute Council. It's my pleasure, on behalf of our council, to welcome you to the third annual Thomas and Barbara Gaehtgens Lecture. The GRI Council is a group of 35 community members who support the GRI by providing resources for acquisitions, supporting educational programs, and funding scholar research through travel grants. Council members have also been able to represent the GRI through trips to other institutions within the US, as well as in China, Japan, Europe, and Latin America. This lecture was established in 2018 through an endowment funded by the GRI Council to honor the contributions Thomas and Barbara Gaehtgens made during Dr. Gaehtgens' 11-year tenure as director of the GRI before his retirement in 2018. Under Gaehtgens' leadership, the GRI established an award-winning exhibition program, launched world-leading digital art and cultural history initiatives, and expanded the breadth of GRI collecting and scholarly support programs to encompass a broader and more interconnected worldview. Today, under the leadership of GRI Director Mary Miller, these initiatives continue and are growing as she leads a dynamic, talented, and committed group of scholars and technical innovators in advancing the mission of the GRI. On behalf of the Council, I would now like to turn this program over to Dr. Miller, who will introduce our speaker. Please enjoy the program.
Thank you, Winston, and thank you, GRI Council, for establishing this lectureship. It's an honor for us to have this annual event. Welcome, as Winston said, I am Mary Miller, Director of the GRI, the Getty Research Institute. Here in Southern California, it's the ecclesiastical hour of 11 a.m. on Sunday, where I'm in my kitchen in Los Angeles on traditional Tongva and Gabrieleño lands. Our speaker is in Paris, where it is Sunday night. Our interlocutor is in North Carolina, just after lunch. You, our audience, ourselves, our community are in many locations, and you may be on other continents as well. Time zones in Spain, in Turkey, Greece, India, the UK, or even Antarctica, or perhaps down the block from me here. We live in this pandemic more in the world than ever, even as paradoxically, we're on the eve of shutdowns anew in California. We seek to live in this world with awareness of where we are, the people who've come before us, the state of the world in 2020. And speaking of awareness, we have a little housekeeping to do. It helps with Zoom and webinars on your end if you have the other devices in your household that might draw Wi-Fi off. And it is Zoom. So we do our best, and we just, well, I just say, if there are little glitches, just bear with us. And we are recording. That is so that we can post this online in a few weeks. If you're uncomfortable with that, please come back to see the posted lecture. This year, the Office of the Director at the GRI has brought together a set of speakers whose work represents the field of global art history and expands art historical scholarship beyond the borders and beyond the boundaries that have traditionally defined it. The talks featured in this series will touch on topics that range from today's the materiality of depictions of race and Black bodies in 18th century painting to the participatory art of the Hostile Terrain 94 project. We do this in the hope of provoking new ways of thinking about how inclusion and exclusion have shaped the field of art history and curatorial practice. All presentations will be on Zoom and all shared with a worldwide audience. We lead off today with our Thomas and Barbara Gaehtgens Lecture. We've been experimenting with formats this year for Zoom presentations, and in light of this desire for experimentation, today's will be in 2 parts or even a little more. We're so grateful that Anne Lafont and Lyneise Williams have engaged with us on the idea of some innovation. So Anne will speak for about 20 minutes, and then our interlocutor, Lyneise Williams, will engage with her on her topic. Then Anne will speak formally a bit more. The question and answer window will be open the entire time, and you should start posing questions whenever they occur to you. I'll be reading the questions, and after part 2, I'll direct them to Anne and Lyneise. I'll introduce Anne to you in just a minute, and then I'll introduce Lyneise in a few minutes after Anne speaks and before Lyneise starts her conversation with Anne. If you have any questions about how to do any of this, you can also put those questions in the Q&A and we'll answer them along the way. It is now my pleasure to introduce Anne Lafont. She is professor, directrice d'études at the School for Advanced Studies in Social Sciences in Paris, at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales, also known as EHESS. To hold this rank is to stand with the world's preeminent scholars. Anne is an art historian and researches visual cultures of the early modern world with a specific interest in the art of the African diaspora in 18th and 19th centuries in an imperial context and with contemporary artistic theory regarding Blackness and creolization. She was trained in France, Canada, and Italy, where she was a fellow at the Villers Medici and at EHESS in Paris. And she knows her way around the GRI archival collections, I am happy to say. I hope she will be back after pandemia to explore further. She was an advisor to the stunning exhibition Le Modèle Noir at the Musée d'Orsay in 2019. And I'm so happy that I was in Paris that summer to see this spectacular contribution to visual scholarship. Anne Lafont has recently published a book on art and race. I hope you can see it here in front of me in my kitchen. Art and Race in the Age of Enlightenment. And it has already earned 2 major prizes in France. And without further ado, I present to you Anne Lafont. Thank you, Anne.
Thank you very much, Mary. I'm very happy to be here with you in a way. And I thank you very much also for the invitation. And I thank the Getty Research Institute, of course. Is Blackness in the making? Would probably be the best way to begin this lecture. I would like to follow as closely as possible what the images, objects, paintings, drawings, and sculptures tell us about representation, but also about the making of the Black body and Black subjectivity. I do not want to return, as I have done elsewhere, to the artistic and aesthetic discourses, academic, critical, or scholarly, in the sense of those of natural history, on race and its intellectual and visual construction, but rather to give voice to the making, the knowing how to make, savoir-faire en français, as it is revealed in the materiality of the artworks, which share the quality of showing Black bodies and personalities. In addition, I would like to accede, if possible, to the reflexivity at work in the material fabrication of that Africanity. I will get the first slide. This is a necessity at a time when, maybe even more than before, we have to take responsibility for the meaning of our art historical research in the quest for a post-racist, even more than post-racial approach. Some of our students no longer credit our discipline with any power, or at the very least, with any emancipatory potential, given that art history would be originally compromised by inequality of wealth. The hierarchy of taste would implicitly reinforce the hierarchy of lives. If we want to be able to answer for our activities as art historians, we must confront the worldview that our objects convey and beyond the sensuous experience that rests on the delight of forms, revive the fundamental meaning of our research. Our raw material is in fact a human activity, creation, and more specifically, the conception and fabrication of works of visual art. This human activity has been attributed a certain exceptionality, but it also has to be examined closely for its political and ideological significations. We know that art may not work only on behalf of the naturalization of prevailing political forces. That means the forms of the majority's domination. If we look closely at the art objects, all the forms of social relations, more complicated ones, may be highlighted. It is in this perspective that I would like to look again at a certain number of objects from the long 18th century. Today, art history, as noted by many of us, requires and opens a place for our discipline to be part of the human and social sciences, inasmuch as they shed light on the world's movement, both its failures and its illuminations. The fabrication of a Black subjectivity in the 18th century, however modest, is part of that collective project. And I would like to highlight it by paying particular attention to what the work of art say. From that standpoint, a sample, both symptomatic and relatively new, when compared to the material in my book, L'Art et la Race, seemed of interest to me. With this drawing of 1807, we may wonder, along with the artist, what detour he had to take in order to paint a young Black man. The enigma embodied in the painter's gaping mouth, and as in the wide open eyes and open hands of this assembly of destitute connoisseurs, lies in the possibility of a failure to bring the Black body into the canon, to render that Black figure in the Greek manner, to the point of making it a model. The trappings of alterity, such as the broom serving as a bludgeon, in place of the attributes of the classical athlete, attest to this possibility. The question that seems to arise is whether Blackness is available to figuration, but also, to an even greater extent, its capacity to serve as a model, and as a result, its right to the image as a sign of civility. The drawing is organized around two series of oppositions that accentuate the border and perhaps even more the limit between one group and another. Hence, the rhetoric of clothing, a sign of civilization, is opposed to nudity and the lower forms of humanity, even animality, the Black man, the children, the dog, and the cat. The space is partitioned around an imaginary line with, in the center, the assembly of connoisseurs, and on the margins, what the assembly of non-scholars and non-connoisseurs, or what pre-intelligibility, once again, the Black men, the children, and the pets, might be. Finally, the distribution of color is more subtle in its work of distinguishing the self and others, but no less effective and fundamental in this drawing. The monochrome sepia tone is in fact the register of the passivity of these allegedly non-human figures, who are the object of the gaze, while the diversity of colors is distributed across the clothing of the connoisseurs and the palette of the painter, who, doubtful about the possibility of using his pigments to provide the Black man with an image, admits that the act of coloring brings to life, confers a soul. As a result, he delegates to the connoisseurs, expert society therefore, the decision to bestow that colored figurability on a Black man. This man, balanced on one foot, is in a contest to be granted a stylistic treatment. equal to that of the connoisseurs, an act that would engage in plastic terms with the reconfiguration of society the very same year of the Slave Trade Act's publication, 1807. In legal terms, at least, that act authorized the abolition of the slave trade in British Empire, that is, the trafficking in Negroes. Given that blacks were legally no longer considered commodities, did that mean that they merited images, even painted portraits? Could they emerge from the realm of grisaille and enter the realm of color, and at the same time take on the many shades of pigments that allow for the possibility of expressing an array of emotions? The question indeed lies in the making, even the coloring of this drawing. This image from the end of the long 18th century, which saw the British legal recognition of the humanity of blacks, leads us on a journey back through different phases moving in that direction, from Watteau in 1700 to Kemper at the end of the century, following a transatlantic history of artistry and blackness. Watteau is a Rococo touchstone in that he was a pioneer in elaborating in plastic terms a self-referential work and an art of the arabesque in color, whether in his paintings or in his drawings. He situated himself between Rubens, as we know. Watteau emulated the explosive figuration of his black magi or even heads of African individuals, drawing from them their full and expressive richness. And Boucher, whose Rococo work, more beholden to the academic canons of genre in painting, perverted, adapted, and academified, in some sense, Watteau's non-standard work. What does that extraordinary sheet of 8 heads, 1 hand, and a mask do to black figurability? What about that trois crayons, white chalk, graphite, and sanguine, the 3-pen drawing technique, which challenged the artist's capacity to make this trinity of materials the token and palette of all the variants the paintings could offer? A white young woman and a black young man, perhaps a child, share the space of the sheet and form a series, not to say a salvo, a modality peculiar to the animation of the faces. Once again, what is at stake is the bringing to life of Black humanity, as if it was necessary to be convinced of it, to convince oneself of the gestural and as a result emotional variety and agency of this little black man. Watteau thus practices the figuration of less familiar flesh tones, and to do so arrogates to himself a 4th color, if that term is accurate, using beige, or perhaps the faded color of a paper that was originally blue and is no longer accessible to the sense of sight, which is in fact the sheet of paper, the réserve, to use the French technical term. As a result, the réserve is the flesh. The réserve is the original colored matter or the matrix common to all humanity. It is the plasticity of monogenism. Monogenism is a natural history theory which argues that all human beings come from a common descent, in opposition to polygenism, which posits that human origins are all different, human beings having many different strains. I return to my argument regarding Watteau's drawing. The reserve is the original colored matter or the matrix common to all humanity. It actually is, in my opinion, the plastic manifestation of monogenism. In this perspective, flesh tones are only a superficial variant, like the mask that is taken off and put back on in the image. In other words, skin color functions as a natural option, a variant in human diversity, but not a stigmata or marker of anything more essential as assumed by the notion of race. As a result, the artist uses these trois crayons to tint the sheet. That means the flesh of paper. For the young Black man, he uses a few dark hatchings of pierre noire mixed with the reddish brown of the sanguine, while the heightening in white indicates the light outside the face. At the base of the neck, it becomes tan, an aura dissipating into smoke along the cheeks, thanks to the magic of the stump. For the young white woman, using exactly the same pencils, the artist distributes the colors differently. He takes advantage of the white chalk to render the bright incarnation of the face and marks the shadows more lightly, while the rosy color, attributable to the few traces of sanguine, brings to life the sweet little female face. Watteau, with the help of his trois crayons, black, white, and red, fleshes out the human diversity without dividing it, without giving any cause for the mutual exclusion of races, even highlighting their common denominators. Watteau's oeuvre from the early years of the 18th century sees the range of color options, a palette of shades to figure the different human flesh tones in opposition to a strict and abstract division, namely a fixed interpretive grid of human diversity as conceived by Lyneise, for example. In this drawing, an individual is still an amalgam, more or less light, more or less dark, of three colors joined together in the figuration of flesh and set against a single black ground. In this case, the matrix reserve. The shared elements of human beings' skin color prevailed over the theoretical conceptualization of a racialized worldview, where the necessary watertight division of one species from another takes material form. The drawing thus defies science in its political and social mission. It offers another option for describing human beings whose singularity is not subject to a program of rationalization that prepares for political conquest. Watteau illustrates and materializes diversity in indivisibility. In the 18th century, race would be mainly interpreted in terms of skin color by artists and naturalists. Nevertheless, another iconography came into being, that of the slave traffickers, ship owners at the head of slave fleets, who in France kept their ships moored in Bordeaux, La Rochelle, or Nantes. They embarked on a lucrative triangular trade, which established the circuit of merchant ships on a commercial principle that would allow them never to leave the quays empty. Textiles and alcohol filled the holds in Europe and were unloaded and sold from African trading posts, where slaves purchased by the European ship owners replaced them to be conveyed to the American colonies and the Caribbean islands where they were sold. There, slaves would work on the plantations. Then the goods from these same plantations, tobacco, coffee, cacao, sugar, would in turn be loaded into the ships to close the circle and replenish the European spices and luxury market. French traders choose to inscribe within the public space of their modern and prosperous cities along the Atlantic coast the explicit trace of their prosperity, founded on slave labor. They displayed and adorned the edifices built in the European metropolises, with the faces of slaves transformed into macarons, an ancestral decorative element whose variations over time tells the story and reveals the source of that arrogant prosperity. This entailed the decorative objectification of Black bodies, deprived of the wealth they generated. Their faces became macarons, little stone masks, minimally orientalized by a few feathers on the head covering, and also minimally ethnicized in a caricatural manner through the negroid features, but without possessing the supreme marker, color. The oriental plume, that of the harem and its black eunuch in fact, is next to the flat nose and fleshy lips. The oriental black in the Renaissance Venetian tradition is on display in that sketchy but effective urban iconography as a possible schema of the Black slave arriving from the colonies across the Atlantic. At this level of interpretation, a simplistic ornament suffices, disregarding the brutal reality of slave life on the plantations, which would have disenchanted and disturbed the narrative that was supposed to tout the glorious and imperial fortune of the local family in its transcontinental commerce. It appears that the known form of Black life, visible since the Venetian 16th century and associated with the luxury of Veronese banquets and Titian's large portraits, worked better as a striking and already recognizable sign for the absent-minded passerby. This latter was supposed to link a theatrical Africanity to the source of the prosperity of the family mansion. For a long time, the 18th century held out as a lure the domestic and exotic servitude, fantasized through the harem, suggesting it was the same as that of the colonial plantation life. At a good distance from the sugar island and at a good distance from the passerby, that tacky Africanity, untouched by the violence of slavery, functioned as an exotic little touch, a painless, almost invisible variant, though skin color was not signified in contrast to the ethnicity effectively traced in the surface of the rounded stone. The mask, previously held by Watteau, is here seized by the Gorgon and turned into stone, replaying the traditional imaginary figure of the Italian mascherone, or large mask with a grotesque face, to be interpreted in terms of the history of slavery and the slave trade. It was now written on the walls of the buildings of the great Nantes families, mostly ship owners. Stone, in a few sculptures in the round, is seized on by negritude without blackness. The mask of Africanity is part of a public tradition of caricature and stereotypical faces. We can have the first discussion if you want to.
Thank you so much, Anne. It's fascinating to think that we have more to come. And at this point in our experimental Zoom structure, we'll next turn to Lyneise Williams. But let me introduce Lyneise first. Lyneise Williams is Associate Professor of Art History at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She's the author of Latin Blackness in Parisian Visual Culture, which examines how Parisian visual language of Latin Americans in popular imagery links Blackness back to Latin American identity. In her current book project, Lyneise explores the intersection of glamour, sports, technology, fashion, masculinity, and the Black male athletic body in the 1920s and 1930s in Paris. So you perhaps see why she is the ideal interlocutor today. In fall of 2016, Lyneise Williams served as a Getty Scholar at the GRI, and we welcome her back, even as we are on different sides of the continent. She is the founder and director of the VERA, the Visual Electronic Representations in the Archive, a collaborative which is an interdisciplinary center that advocates for culturally responsible archival practices that address the significant erasures in visual, material, and historical representation that disproportionately affects communities of color. She was appointed by Chief Justice of the State of North Carolina by the Supreme Court, Supreme Justice in North Carolina, to serve on her advisory committee on portraits. She earned her PhD at Yale, where I served as her director of graduate studies for at least a year. I'm so happy to see her again across this screen. She is our interlocutor today, and so I turn the program over to Lyneise and Anne.
Okay. First, I would very quickly say thank you so much to Mary and the Getty for inviting me to have this conversation with Anne and your audience. And thank you so much for what you've given us thus far, Anne. Your discussion of artist materials in these 18th century works is a deep dive into their distinctive physicality and physiology, or what we call materiality in the making of Black flesh. You talk about how a close inspection of Watteau's drawings reveals numerous clay chalk layers of a multitude of colors that comprise the various Black figures' skin. Embedded in that description of Black flesh, as you point out, is the réserve, or the blue color of the paper. I think about other modes of representation where Black skin is accrued through a process, like rotogravure. In this case, the process involved art directors, photographers, and printing technicians collaborating to adapt a photomechanical printing process to amplify glamour photography strategies so that it generated a glowing effect on Black athletes' skin, printed in 1920s French newspapers. Can you talk more about how materials and the act of making Blackness is tied to the act of perception and how viewers see Blackness?
Thank you very much, Lyneise. I will try to answer your questions, and maybe to say that the way I've been working with the question of materiality and looking really closely to the objects and what kind of choices were made by the artist to represent Black skin. And what I considered the most interesting is not to understand how biographical of or a biography of Watteau will help understand how he came to represent, for example, Black subjects, but how he made a couple of choices which were very materialistic, what he could have under his hand, and how he decided in the same sheet to have the same material to represent Black skin and white skin. And that was what was fundamental for me to understand how, in a way, practice could be an alternative of the natural history theory which was developed at the same time. He would really stand for the monogenism option, which is you have the same material, but you can give all the branches, all the ways humanity is embodied in a way. And I think it's interesting to think of gestures, techniques as something which is not obviously or not necessarily, I would say, a logic of rationalization of choices because you are sympathetic with one theory of another. It's not what I'm trying to do, but practically, the choice he made, Watteau, for example, are the manifestation of something which can be echoed in a more intellectual sphere. And at the first time in my book, I was very interested in the discourses, and I privileged the discourses on art and then confronted them to the practice. And now I'm trying to see how all what's happening in the studio, in a way, is be interpreted like something, well, I have only that, only these pigments, and I can do only that, or be connected in a way with the intellectual sphere, which is outside the studio. And I think it's very interesting because it's also the way we as art historical writers or art historians, we can contribute to the debates about the making of race. It's where we are so specific and we have a kind of expertise of what is making art, which can be connected once again to the history, intellectual history or science history and so on. And it's where I believe it's interesting not to think only of the alterity in something which is really ideological. It's also something very practical. And how he decided to have on the same sheet, even if it's not a work of art like a painting he wanted to exhibit, it was something he made. And this young white woman and this black child, because I think it's a child, he can have in the same space, the idea of imagining them or portraying them with exactly the same material. And it's an option. It's an option to think that you don't need something else to make the black flesh. Am I clear enough? Because I'm trying to say it in English, and is that okay? Fine.
Okay, well, we will now pivot to the next part of the talk.
Fine.
So if you can share screens with us, we will move forward.
Okay. I share screen. Wait a minute. Here. Is that okay? Because I don't see the chat. I hope you have.
Yes.
Okay, thank you, Lyneise, thank you. Wait a minute. Fine. Luster, gleam, brilliance, sparkling black is another option in the fabrication of the blackness of flesh. Its foundations lay in painting, but as well in the preparation of their bodies, in other words, in the application of makeup by the blacks themselves, as we see in this unique painting by Kirk Valkenburg. A Netherlandish painter of still lifes, he was entrusted with the visual inventory of American flora by a planter from Dutch Guiana. The painting, considered an archive of Black lives in the Americas of the 700s, offers a view of the huts as a place of recreation for Creole Africa, in the sense that this space was invented from the diverse scraps of life of captive Africans in the process of inventing an American way of life without the help of the unified transmission of a common language, culture, religion, or patrimony. The enslaved Africans were traded in different places on the continent, and they were not sold to the American colonists in keeping with community criteria that would have allowed them to preserve and share an ancestral heritage with their brothers and sisters in misfortune. They were sold and distributed in observance of the supposed racial criteria of skill, or the suitability of their bodies for the slave tasks to which the masters condemn them, thus presenting an obstacle to the maintenance of a homogeneous original social body. Blackness of skin and slavery, the only common denominators of the experience of these individuals, were thus also the only foundations on which to build new communities cobbled together from individual experiences. The 30-old people, men, women, and children with robust bodies, exuding a luminosity in the intense blackness of their flesh tones, though 3 or 4 of them have skin whose shade verges on brown, are assembled here for a ceremony. Drums and choreographies, smoking herbs in the stems of pipes, drinks, and the oiling of bodies coated with transparent and reflective ointments such as palm oil, for example, which was precisely found in Africa and South America, were part of the stage event. Everyone seems to find his or her place and indulges in a moment of rejoicing and pleasures. A couple in black and brown kiss languorously on the right, and the woman has the colored finery of feast days, scarves, bracelets, necklaces, earrings. For the men, drums and maracas. For the women, dancing, their members seemingly carried off by the rhythms and percussion. The illusion of being carefree is adopted. In the painter's eye, by the slaves themselves, thanks to intoxicating substances, one cannot truly answer these questions. Yet in the distance, and at the far end of the perspective, we also see the permanent, solidly built residence. In other words, the master's house in the place of honor and the piece of fencing visible on the left recalls the captive space within which such a feast, necessarily supervised, could take place. Nevertheless, the Africans made their preparations, embellished their appearances, and the European artist translated them in painting, taking inspiration from the onyx stone to render the qualities of these bodies in performance. The more profound, the more intense, the more luminous the black of the skin looked, the freer these young people could feel in these interstitial times when the madness of a celebration transported them to the world before the Middle Passage. Carnivals have endured to our own time in a form more or less folkloric, more or less recognized by the direct ears of the Maroons, who are concerned about the authenticity of their traditions. At the Neg Marron Festival in French Guiana, for example, one still sees in an incautious amalgam that this tradition of coating the body with oil, in this case with used lubricating oil, petrol, and soot, echoes the more recent and racist tradition of blackface in a parade that caricatures African customs of the Americas. The application of makeup to the body, understood in all its forms, in its multiple orientations, connected with the application of the makeup to surfaces such as painting canvases, is, from my point of view, one of the great discoveries of art history, which in its materialist project must view these two macular practices as sisters, as forms, differentiated to be sure, but as common in the animation of our bodies as in our decorations. They both appeal to our senses, touch as well as sight. Through the study of art outside the European fine arts, the realm of art history is enlarged to manifestation outside the West. but also in return, it allows us to revisit the space of European art itself, and especially the practices of white makeup, aristocratic powders corresponding to the contemporary white paintings of Oudry and Bose, for example. The threat of racial mixing that fueled the expanded performance of the whiteness of European bodies must also be understood as an echo of the myth of white Greek antiquity brought to light by the historian Philippe Jocquet. From the first racial conceptualization of the world by the French scientist, doctor, and traveler François Bernier in 1680s, white and black were polarized as supposed opposites. For several decades, a certain number of shades, not yet fixed by Lyneise, floated between black and white. In 1735, he proposed red and yellow as the two other pillars of that intellectual organization of human diversity. In addition, a strong contrast pervaded the arts and theories of color, to the point of excluding black and white from its strict definition. Nevertheless, they persisted together as boundaries and equivalents that defined each other, to such a point that the first abolitionist icon took material form through that play. The medallion invented by the ceramist and entrepreneur Josiah Wedgwood to found visually the British Society of the Friends of the Blacks in 1787 adopted that polarization. The black and the white rested at the time on the technique of jasperware or stoneware invented by the abolitionist Wedgwood in the 70s. Whereas he had ensured the success of these ceramic techniques made famous by the blue ground and white bas-relief, he now adapted the contrast, reversing it for the good cause for the society for effecting the abolition of the slave trade. The success of the medallion, whose motif had been invented by Wilhelm Hackwood, resulted in multiple versions in paintings, pins, and engravings. The kneeling and chained black young man pleads for his liberation, his physical and moral uplift. The gesture is that of an emancipation granted by the masters, who consent to lift the slave up to the rank of man. But it may also be a form of peaceful black conquest in adversity. In any case, it historicizes the repetition of that knee to the ground by Martin Luther King praying, and even more recently, the analogical gestural signatures of the Black Lives Matter movement after Colin Kaepernick. An excellent example of the avatars, characteristic of the theory of the Afrotropes proposed by our colleagues Hugh Copeland and Krista Thompson, that motif resists any univocal revival and must be interpreted in terms of its multiple and possibly contradictory reclassifications between the 18th century and today. That medallion, an excellent example as well of the circulation of forms from the body to the painting, from the body to the paper, from the body to the object, requires us to abandon a restricted history of artistic forms uncorrelated with the history of performance, within which only objects counted as places for delegating aesthetic commitments. Conversely, we must henceforth take advantage of an expanded history of the visual arts in which together paintings and bodies are matrices and media to be apprehended in relation to each other since the early modern era. In the contrapposto In the contraposto pose of the gentleman and great British tourist, but also here to the nonchalant ephebe of ancient marble, the Black representative of the National Convention, Jean-Baptiste Bellay, a member of the French Society of the Friends of the Blacks, had in turn embodied one of the extremes of that black and white polarity of humanity. Depicted by the painter Girodet in 1797, in the midst of the French Revolution, Bellay is leaning on the base of the bust of Raynal, an Enlightenment philosopher. The two combine their efforts within the framework of renewed citizenship in the light of two revolutions, that of Saint-Domingue, future Haiti, and the French Revolution, to found a racial brotherhood. In painting, this brotherhood was expressed in terms of intermediality, because since the Renaissance controversy of the Paragone, the art of drawing was recognized by the two clans, the partisans of sculpture and those of painting, as a common core curriculum, which in our inquiry is yet another version of monogenism. The shared and primary humanity of the Black man and the white man is manifested here by drawing, which presides over their respective representations, reiterating in painting an equality of natural right that had been realized in France some 3 years earlier on the legal and political level by the vote in favor of the abolitionist law of February 4th, 1794. Whereas color had been the main concern in the racial inquiry of Enlightenment artists and naturalists over a long period of time, in the late 18th century, it would lose its centrality for the understanding and representation of alterity in favor of a science and an art now concerned with finding a reliable base for articulating human diversity. The reversibility of color, experienced in the example of the albinos, and even the invisibility of the human stain, to borrow Philip Roth's expression, and as a result, its discriminating instability had made it suspect to the modern science being elaborated in about 1800. The graphic material of that science, let's call it neoclassical, rested exclusively on the line. The science had been preceded by the experiments of Pierre Camper, a physician and draftsman from Amsterdam, in his figuration on human diversity. The engraving by Camper, published in his dissertation on the natural varieties, 1792, and translated into French by Jean Sen, also Winkelmann's translator, emphasized the epistemological break related to skin color as a primary marker of race. In the plastic arts, it imposed the idea of the alteration of the European standard, even of the human ideal, on the level of skeleton. In other words, pre-humanity, accessible through the observation of the characteristics of its bones, was then translated into the line. If we look at Kemper's plate, the living first drafts or sketches of humanity, such as the ape and the black man, were apprehended through an attentive study of their cranial bone structure, incomplete when compared to that of the white man, the most developed one. In this print, the Apollo of Belvedere is an unattainable ideal, emerging from the hands and mind of the ancient Greco-Roman sculpture, considered to be the ancestor of the civilized European of the Enlightenment. That graphic construction, conceived as a demonstration, rested on a geometrical schema, literally stripped of its flesh, in which the play of contour lines and axis lines had the aim of making the very structure of bodies manifest inasmuch as it detaches itself from the fleeting and unstable impressionist illusions of colors. From now on, the difference was not superficial. It was not one of skin color, but structural. It relied on the skeleton. It was now a matter of giving the technical means of science and drawing to the burgeoning anthropological investigation of using the diagram, the systemicity of its transformation into an image to encore a natural science of man, disqualifying Lyneise colorist science in favor of anatomical archaeology, in other words, a hard science of humanity. Kemper's plates thus appears as the perfect graphic tool for that project, to make the hierarchy of races a science. Kemper brought about that epistemological break because, as a physician and a draftsman, he did not delegate the picturesque illustration of his discourse to an artist outside the investigation, and found the means invented by him in his natural history cabinet to provide proof through the image of an evolutionist hierarchy. He probably only recorded on a paper his experimental manipulation of the skulls stored on the shelves that served as his laboratory. The order in which they were arranged established the composition of the plate and the demonstrative argument of the scientist. Explicitly, through that image, Kemper conditioned the reception of the theory of evolution, later conceptualized by Darwin, an image that was subsequently, sorry, I lose my line. Sorry. An image that was subsequently erected into an icon by the many graphic avatars to which it gave and continues to give rise. The visual efficacy of that plate, founded on its systematic composition, would lead to the naturalization of its fundamental falsehood, the granting of a skull to a sculpture. Kemper, like it or not, thus inaugurated the necessity of giving scientific credence to racism at the price of fake news. On the material level, the denial of colorism in his study would resonate with other initiatives as the one that led Tardieu to illustrate the color chart of black flesh tones without resorting precisely to pigments to describe phenotypical variants. Instead, he made a perfectly unintelligible diagram that would, however, convey the idea of racial mixing by the geometrical display of white and black segments. It's the lower side of the image you can see here. This was the absolute opposite of the pinturas de castas, casta painting in newspaint. The imperative for science of race made everyone forget that the tool of the painter's palette, a palette composed of pigments, precisely of pigments, had a greater ability to render, represent, even embody the phenomenon of skin pigmentation. Metropolitan anthropological science made a gesture pointless on the cognitive level, but sure, reliable on the theoretical one. At that moment in colonial history in Paris, equality of citizenship between blacks and whites was now political and social given. The first abolition of slavery dated to 1794. From now on, one had to teach a racial order emancipated from pigmentary aristocracy. The work of science should thus be able to establish another, more infallible system of distinction. A scientific truth and a scientific order should be able to substitute for self-evidence previously based on the senses, because that hierarchy grounded in skin color, though naturalized throughout the 18th century, had been overturned by the revolution. Science continued its distinctive work of social organization based on race, independent of French political vicissitudes, and especially the re-establishment of slavery in 1802. Then it achieved its apogee in the wake of the second abolition of slavery in 1848, with Gobineau's essays on the inequality of the races, published precisely between 1849 and 1855. The science of races then culminated in its establishment of a social order founded on scientific stools. Anthropology took on the mission, among others, to replace a slave-holding political order that had now disappeared with one based on the hierarchy of races. Conclusion. In a few pieces of architecture, paintings, drawings, ceramics, and engravings, and in keeping with various plastic and graphic modalities, the adventure of race was written over the long 18th century. Black subjectivity was thus articulated through materials and mental images of all kinds, as diverse as the different blacks of the skin of Africans. Actually, I have tried to show how the material investigation permits and at best conveys an understanding of how the long 18th century of the Atlantic figured out effectively human diversity and specifically the variety of the Africans. From Guyana to Paris and from Nantes and London to Saint-Domingue, in a quest to capture accurately the material forms of these brown and black skins, but also in a concern to, at the same time, distinguish oneself from it, become familiar with it, and establish it at the right distance. It turned out that the means were multiple, the perception of that blackness equally so, and a black agency can be extracted from this collective and long-lived inquiry, an agency that shows and shapes both the viewpoint and the interpretation. The Londoners' resistance to the canonical fiction of the studio model, the expressive facets of Watteau's beautiful noodle face, the festive sociability of slaves on the colonial plantation, and even the invention of the knee to the ground between plea and prayer, and in any case, a pacifist gesture, express the social, artistic, emotional, political resource of the blacks. Despite scientific racism and caricatural stereotypes made of stone that tended to fix blackness in a lifeless schema, in a grotesque sign, Africans invented and created wherever they were. The vital energy of blacks from the long time of slavery would, in a history that still remains to be written, find escaping lines in maroonage, another colorist metaphor, in the strict social sense, as well as in the figural and aesthetic one. In art, a kind of maroonage was deployed through the gradual taking up of the tools of representation. Indeed, at the end of the 19th century, blacks pierced the space of the painting, the frame imposed by perception, and then artists seized on the means of figuration in color, in forms that today painters Sherry Samba and Kerry James Marshall gives us as a plastic denouement in that long history of art and emancipation, and open up new perspectives. Thank you.
Fantastic. You brought up so many compelling points that I'd like to follow up on, Anne, but for the sake of time, I've isolated a few, just a few. In your discussion of the Valkenburg work, you situate painting as the starting point of a genealogy for representations of lustrous, glossy Black skin. You interpret luminous Black skin in two ways: as a signal of commodity status by way of its visual connection to onyx stone sculptures by European painters and sculptors. And number two, as a self-fashioning practice by Black people, similar to the oiling of bodies seen in contemporary carnival in the Caribbean. In your other scholarship, you talk about glossy skin in the space of the enslaved body, like on the auction block, as a way of hiding the violence of slavery on the body, so it appears polished when it's actually damaged. Can we think of shine and glossiness in other ways? For example, there's emerging scholarship like Krista Thompson's work on Kehinde Wiley that interprets glistening Black skin as a blinding flash of visibility or a point of visual saturation that blinds the viewer. Or in the hands of Black people as a signifier of good health. Valkenburg's painting depicts enslaved bodies enacting creolized dance as a way of suggesting some connection to a pre-Middle Passage life. In some of those West African contexts, like some of the Mende groups in Sierra Leone or the Yoruba of Southeast Nigeria, luminous skin is tied to excellent health, good character, and illumination from within. How does this map onto the work you discuss?
It's very interesting that you're bringing up the work of Krista Thompson regarding shine and how it can be something that, as you said, that is flashing in the eyes of spectators or regarders. What I was suggesting with the onyx stone is, as you said, it's a kind of commodification, of course, of the Black body, but it's also the way I wanted to propose, in a way, is that maybe Valkenburg, because we have there someone who testified, who was on the spot in a way, and I think maybe this brilliance was an offer, an aesthetic offer of the Blacks themselves that suggests to Valkenburg the idea to figure this brilliance. And I was thinking that maybe we can connect the fortune of the onyx kind of representation of Black bodies through the fact that a couple of painters went to the plantation and did testify and did see how they were preparing their own bodies. And it would be in a way something reverse. It's not the commodifications that would give the lead to the representation in a brilliance kind to the painter, but the painter that who testified or who was witness of this kind of preparation and that gives a cue to the idea that we can make or shape the Black body in this kind of onyx and brilliant stones in a way. So I just wanted to envisage, to figure out what would be if we inverse the filiation from one to another. You know, if commodification is not the first goal of the usings of the onyx stones, but also something which is connected to a kind of reality to which they had access through a couple of paintings where we can see Blacks having their own preparation, their own makeup, and we could see through this kind of painting. So that was probably what I wanted to suggest, and maybe I was a little bit too quick about that to make it clear. And the other thing I wanted also to highlight a little bit is that we had, you are suggesting, of course, that this kind of practices may have an origin in the African societies' practices themselves before the Middle Passage. And that's what I wanted also to point when I said that this kind of palm oil trees, we could find them, and we can still find them in Africa as in Latin America. So we can imagine that this know-how that was taken with the slaves who were, as we all know, they couldn't come with all the tools they could have, or all their patrimony, as I explained, but maybe we think of immaterial patrimony, the use of the palm oil tree, for example. They could re-engage with the new milieus, this kind of savoir-faire know-how, and use it to use the same kind of oil to embellish, to make ornaments of their bodies. So absolutely, I'm sure there are connections, and they have been done by anthropologists as well, between what's, oh, I see, Mary, maybe I should stop there.
No. I just actually thought that it would be a good time to add in one of the questions that has come from Rick Powell. I think he's also in North Carolina, who wants to, I'm going to just read his question. He's thinking about where gloss and shininess appear in paintings, Dutch still lifes in the 17th and 18th centuries, and how the shininess is used to render precious and semi-precious metals. So is there some link, some subliminal link between Black flesh and commodities?
Absolutely. Unfortunately, I'm sure he's absolutely right. Yeah, that's why I introduce also this onyx little sculpture, because I think what is at stake, I would say, is something which is haptical. How the glossiness of the objects and of the black body in this kind of representation signifies how manipulation, but in the primary and secondary sense were important. The idea of the black body as something you can manipulate and which is haptic, like sculpture. And I'm thinking about a very good study about that, that I read about haptical of the black body in the 18th century, and how sculpture, little ones and big ones, did play with this curiosity, the commodities and curiosity of the black flesh in the eyes of the European at this time. So I think he's absolutely right. It's the same aesthetic regime of something which is appealing the eyes as well as the hand, I would say. And glossiness, brilliance, helps to be in between these two regimes, I would say.
Well, actually, if we have some time, I have another question for you. You opened your presentation declaring that you weren't going to address the history of race, and instead you wanted to focus on how art history can work through racism, or how it can be an apparatus or provide a language to talk about racism. Given that your reading of William Hackworth's motif on Wedgwood's medallion suggests that the figure has agency within the abolitionist framework, can you clarify how we can understand the history of racism in the image through the history of art?
Difficult question. I will try to answer with a couple of topics that I have privileged to justify how, because it's something which is important to me, to justify how art history is a specific discipline to address the question of race and racism, I think. But maybe I will say just one thing at the beginning of the lecture. What I wanted to point is that I will not so much mobilize the discourses this time, and I will specify or talk more about the objects themselves. But I think one another has to be crossed and to be worked together. It's not because I think it's not interesting. It's just that I've been doing that so much. I wanted to see how much it opens space to privilege the material specificities of the object and how it engage also with the questions of race. And well, maybe I just say another something connected to what you just said was the William Hackwood motifs for the medallions, the medallion. What was also interesting for me is because we have all had the sense that this man on his knee and praying to have the chains off is something which doesn't give the right space to how enslaved Africans struggled to get the emancipation, and how all along the 18th century there were riots, there were fires, there were rebellions in the what I know better in the island, in the French islands. And it's these tensions that went to the abolition of slavery and the emancipation and the independence of Haiti. So it's absolutely true. But I wanted also to give something to the ideas that there were maybe some kinds of resistance which we can entitle pacific ones, which were not so much demonstrative, but maybe this figure, maybe this image is not just only the image of passivity, but something which is not a peaceful gesture to negotiate also, the emancipation. And I wanted to reintroduce this image in the history of emancipations, that in Black emancipation and conquest, as an option, a peaceful way of conquering in emancipation. That one. And I go to the real questions that you are addressing to me. I think there are three arguments to justify our discipline, our like the main, maybe, or the major way to address the question of racism. First one, of course, we know, and for example, Kemper, I've been talking about him just before, he, in the first paragraph of his dissertation on nature or varieties in nature, he explains that he has become a physician and has made inquiries in the origin of the color of the Black men and women, because when he was very young, he did cross the path of a Black woman in Amsterdam, and he was impressed at the point he wanted to understand where does it come from. So the question of visuality, of the site, of the alterity as the main enter in the experience of the other is, to me, often testified in the South, at least in the 18th century, but I think it's something which goes on. How you experience alterity, not with touch, not with the hearing at first, not with anything else, but the sight of Blackness is always something which is mobilized in the South of the 18th century. So, and visibility is our material, our first material, I think, in art history. The second one, I think, is more about how the color, of course, and the pigment, which is something which belongs to the dermatology, but belongs also to the spices and belongs to the also to the artistic practice and the palette. So all this regime of the significations of pigments needs us to understand how the aesthetic discourses are a way to naturalize the political agency of, in a way, dominations, and how you can find how is in the academic discourses, for example, in the 17th and 18th century, you can read text saying that you have to put the black figures here and the white ones here so that they can, the one will be a stooge to the other, and the beauty of the white will be enhanced by the fact that you have a couple of black and brown figures all around. So it's something which is, you think you're talking about art, but you are talking about political and even of social order. So I think, again, if we go through the material of art history, we can see how little arrangements in the composition of a painting are echoing the pigmentary aristocracy, I would say. And it's interesting to go to the point in something which looks very natural and aesthetic, but is grounded on politics. And maybe if I have time for a last point in this answer, is maybe something related to the religious tradition of blackness as a punition. And here again, it's a question of colors that is connected to the question of religion. And I think we have so many ways to make obvious how we understand visibility and colors. And we as experts, as art historians, expert of this kind of materials, we can explain how we did infuse all other places of connection in our societies and even in 18th century societies. Sorry if I was too long.
And there have been a lot of questions that have come in about the Watteau. And they've continued to come in. I have to say, this has been a very stimulating set of questions. So let me just give you a sense of the range that come from Anel and Rachel and, gosh, David, others, that there's interest in how there seems to be a white hand holding out the black mask. So is there any way in which Watteau is himself a kind of activist to say, it is just this thing? So that's one set of questions.
Wait a minute.
Oh, good. We get to look at it again. Excellent.
I go quick as I can.
And then while you're finding it, there's also a question that has come in that points out that there is Rosenberg and Pratt found brown pastel also in this in this image. So perhaps are there more than 3 colors that are at play? In any case, yes. Let me just let you start talking about this.
That was an activist. Well, I didn't come to that question before, and I didn't think of him in this way and in something. Activism is something where you want your ideas come public and make their impact on the society. I don't think you can be an activist only in your studio. Maybe I'm wrong, but I don't see that this way. So what he's doing there, I think he's playing with, he's playing as an artist with forms and with what can be the color of the skin and how you can change, how it's the same, and of course the mask is signifying with etchings, with black etching, so it's more black. But I would say it's not enough to make of him an activist. It's someone, on the other hand, that I think the way he's making black subjectivity is not so much influenced by racist terrorist. So we see he's looking for something. He's looking for maybe an artistic challenge more than a political one. And it gives something which tells something we can interpret in relation to, for example, natural history theory, monogenism. But it's not that I say he's supporting that and he's going public with that to change the world. It's not what I see. It's not what I believe of that, but maybe I don't have all the keys to in his biographical deeds that would reinforce the idea of Watteau as an activist, but I didn't hear of that before. So I would be more, I am trying also to disconnect the biography of the painter, of the artist, of the draftsman, and what the image says per se in a way. And my interpretation of Watteau and Watteau's sheet and monogenism is not something that I try to found on a declaration, on a discourse of Watteau himself. It's something that I'm trying to figure in looking at the drawing itself. And
do we know that Watteau was aware of these theories of racial diversity?
No, I don't know. I would not say that because it was not so obvious in the very first decade of the 18th century. And it's something which has been developed and knew its climax, I would say, in the 30s or the 40s. So it's a little bit before. But there were already an inquiry which took many ways in understanding the origin of the color of the black skin. And then it was constructed in a theory. So the questions were around and he could have been aware of them, but I would not say, it is not necessary to say that Watteau was an adept of this theory, to see it in the form, in the materiality of the sheet itself, I think, in my interpretation, again.
Sally Stein asks another interesting question about materiality, and that is that you spoke about the three colors of the pastels used in the Watteau drawing. But she wonders if you might comment about the three colors, red, white, and blue, that are used in your very first opening image that somehow says Britain, France, and the United States in ways that are quite powerful.
Again, thank you for this question because it leads to other tracks in a way, because I didn't think of that neither. And actually, what the problem is, I will try to do something else, but I cannot see the drawing on my screen because I have our faces and I don't know. I will try something else so that I can see and maybe improvise an answer to this question. No, yes, I see the drawing. Well, I saw the colors as something which is exclusive of the white man in the drawing, and the painter is in the grisaille as well. But I didn't think it's obvious now that I'm told that these three colors are there, but I should have, it's always like that when you are writing art history or researching art history, you're trying to have a series of objects so that you can identify a specific interpretation. And now I need to see many other studios drawing of the same time and see how these colors are visible in other contexts to come back with an interpretation of this specific one. But I didn't think of that before, but maybe the person has something to say about it. I would be very curious to know, and if she or he has something to tell me about.
We can put her in touch with you directly. I believe she's here in Los Angeles with us. Lyneise, I am monopolizing the questions a bit now. Is there, would you like to jump back in at this point, I can also keep reading the questions, and we still have more questions about the Watteau.
Okay, do you want to just follow up on the Watteau questions?
Well, I wondered, yes, and particularly since I think, Anne, it is the next slide in your PowerPoint, if we want to go back to taking a look at it. Or no, it's a few in, sorry. There we go. So Hector writes, and I'm just going to read this question because it requires getting, and I hope, Anne, that you can see the picture. Your reading of the Étude de tête is compelling. If you can speak about how this reading puts pressure on the way the white pigment is used in this image. For example, the third figure from the left is surrounded by white, which establishes the ground for the figure, which then blends right into the figure below, transforming from negative space to the accidental splash of light on the fashionable hat. How might the different uses of color, of the color white across the image, be connected with the emergence of whiteness as an ontological category? It's a big question.
Yes, it is. No, it's very interesting, and I absolutely agree to the idea with which the whiteness in the sheet is something also which delimits in a way the black subject, but is irradiating when it's dealing with the white ones which are down the sheet. So the ontological whiteness in this I would not say that much, but it's because when you look at the three black faces, you see that it's something which is more from atmosphere, and which is something which is the stump of the white chalk is something which tries to give a materiality to the space, and as I said in the paper before, something like an aura of luminosity of the black faces. So I think it's not. Oh, one can interpret that in a way of conquering the blackness, but I didn't see that this way. And when you look at the faces of the woman, the white is in the body. It's not outside the body like in the black. So no, I didn't see it once again like something which would be so much stabilized. I like the whiteness trying to conquer all the sheet of paper. I wouldn't say that. It's functioning differently in relation to the black bodies and to the white ones. And in this sense, it's not unified as an idea of the white, I think. So maybe we are just a little bit before whiteness was something which has to be so convincing and so identified, as we will see in, for example, in the Bose and the Oudry that I've shown also in the paper just before. But one can discuss, maybe. Well, it's my take on it. But I will go further with this idea of ontological whiteness already in the Watteau's sheet. Thank you. Thank you very much.
We have a couple of questions that address the classicizing aspects. And, you know, I'm realizing it's now after 9:30 in the evening in Paris. So we don't want to keep you here too late into the evening. But one of the questions is and Monica, I think, asks us this question about the oiling of the body, the tradition of the Greek and Roman athlete. Is that a reference that is coming to play? I think this is with respect to the Dirk Falkenberg image. Is it about the classical? Is it
no, if I understand well, if the classical Greek athlete oiling his body for the performance is at stake in the making of the painting by Falkenberg. If it's the question, then I understood well. I didn't connect that to this effective tradition of Greek athletes in the antiquity. It was for me really something which might have happened in the plantation in Guyana when he attended the ceremony of the slaves, who did not go through, I think, the Greek athletes to invent preparation, the makeup of their own bodies for their ceremonies. So, but it could be in the head of Valkenburg, which I don't know. He did not write about it. He didn't say about it, but it could be. I think it's not necessary. And sometimes it's something I've been trying to do also when I was working on the portrait of Madeleine. And, you know, it's this wonderful portrait of a Black woman in 1800, which is now at the Louvre, which was the first painting in the exhibition, the Modèle Noir. And so much has been written about her, compared to Amazons and compared to Marianne, which is the figure, allegory of Republic in France, and to so many topics. And what I try is to give back to the model a kind of agency and a genealogy that you would propose to the painter, where the references would not be exclusively the canonical, classical references of the French painter. And that's why I try to connect her to the Signard, for example, to the Placé in Louisiane, or to the Matador in the French West Indies. And when you think of that, you don't need exclusively and every time to go through the classics, I would say, and you can find other ways to transmit and to have an iconography which comes from tradition, meets legend practices from African societies in the Black Atlantic, I would say. And it's what I'm trying to do. So it's more interesting for me in this case to think of a proposal of the oiling body of the Blacks themselves, coming, as Lyneise explained, from traditions before the Middle Passage, and suggesting that this was their offer to the European painter, than to think of Falkenberg. But it's methodological. I don't want to disregard this eventuality, but it's not the one I've been followed, and I'm trying to follow also. Just please tell me if you cannot understand me. I would be happy to try again in another way, because sometimes it's difficult for me in English. So please.
There are lots of interesting comments and questions in the Q&A, and I can't get to all of them, but perhaps we could go back and just, there's perhaps one last way for you to talk about this interesting topic is by returning to the Girodet painting. I don't know if I guess we should all take a look at it. That's Julie Saville has asked a question about whether the what significance you might attribute to the use of the marble bust to represent Raynal and the living figure of Belay in legislative dress or costume. And then perhaps we will let you finally take your leave. You've been incredibly patient and continuing on with us into the late evening.
It's my pleasure. It's a painting I've been writing on it for years now, and I'm always happy to talk about it. But I'm always how would I say that? I don't want to repeat myself. That's why sometimes I'm just going a little bit quickly about it. How it comes to be that there are both of them, one alive and one in a bust marble. First of all, and it's never enough to have the facts, but it's good to begin with the facts. Reynal was died actually in 1796, and the very same year he died, a sculptor, Joseph Espercieux, which was a friend of Girodet, exhibited at the Paris Salon a bust in terracotta of Reynal as a remember and homage to the philosopher who just died, and who during the revolution was not at all very welcome by the Jacobins, for example, because he was for not a revolution, he was for something which was in between, and he wanted to have not a democracy, but a kingdom with some arrangement. So he was really, at the end of his life, he was not very welcome by the revolutionaries. But Espercieux wanted to exhibit this bust of terracotta once again, which was in a brown color in a way. And Girodet, 1 year after that, decided to make the painting. And he introduced the bust he had seen in the exhibition of Reynal, because in Reynal in 1780, he was the first to publish a text by Diderot, who was defending the emancipation of the Black people and at least the abolition of the slave trade. So there was a connection in the Enlightenment philosophy and the question of the abolition of the slave trade and the abolition of slavery. And what is very interesting in this painting is that Girodet decided to transform the bust in terracotta in brown, once again, from Jean-Joseph Espercieux in a pseudo white marble, which did not exist at that time, but because he wanted to, contrast the black and the white in a way. And afterwards, Jean-Joseph Espercieux in 1800 or 1800, I think, he decided to realize the marble he had the idea of by the painting of Girodet. So it's very interesting how the question of colors and he also of materiality of the sculpture in the painting did play a game in the purpose that was the one of Girodet in making this contrast, and also with with the socle. I don't know how you say that in English. I should, but on what is the marble, on what is the bust. There's something which is something in common. The basement. I don't know, the base of the. And both of them are almost two branches of the same, the same column. So it's very interesting. And I think I'm talking, and I forgot what was exactly the question, but I'm not sure I answered it.
No, whether there was meaning in the way the materiality is represented, and you have just exactly landed on that.
Okay,
I think one of the things that I wish we had in Zoom was a way to put our hands together to thank you for this extremely interesting morning, afternoon, evening, or night, depending on where you are. It is really fantastic. And if Anne is willing, we are going to share some of the unanswered questions because we couldn't get to all of them. There are a lot of thoughts that people have about how interesting the works are that you have presented to us today, Anne, and we will share this food for thought with you as well. Lyneise, it's been great to have you on screen with Anne. It's really been so stimulating for me. And I feel as though this is one of those ways that Zoom lets us do things that are not just a translation, but actually an enhancement of the intellectual stimulation that I hope gives us some cheer in this very long year of 2020. So we can't clap, but we are clapping. You can hear me.
Thank you, Lyneise. Thank you, Mary.
Thank you, Mary.
It is totally our pleasure. And then I just want to tell people that we have a few other programs coming up. If we could have the slide back up, just to let you know what's coming up at the GRI. Next is going to be the Imaginaries of Los Angeles. This is this week, so we hope you'll be able to tune in for that. And something that is near and dear and to my heart and much fun is the Ahrensbergs in Hollywood discussion series. This is jointly run with the Philadelphia Museum of Art. They are a fascinating family of collectors, and then additional programs that launch in the new year. I do hope that this long year 2020 will come to an end in January of 2021. And it would be fantastic if our robust series of programs this month of December 2020 is what is most in your mind as you reflect upon this very strange holiday season some months from now. Thank you and goodbye.